all those years as a U.S. Senator, and I learned a lot of lessons in the process, and I'd like to pass those on to those who come after me so that we can have a continuation of work that really helps us do a better job. The most important part of this will be doing a lot of good with a lot of really outstanding people, because some of the best policy papers ever written are going to be part of this foundation. It's a real treasure house resource that I'm leaving not only to the Senate, but to every college in Utah and, of course, every college across this country. And my goal is to help people to understand that there's a way of being effective, even though you may be from a small state, you may not have a huge congressional delegation, but you get things done anyway. Listen very carefully to what people are saying, let them know that we're interested in their ideas, and then spend time making sure that we work on their ideas and put them forward. I think we can do that. And I think that the Hatch Foundation will lay the groundwork to be able to do some things that carry on the work that I've done long after I'm gone. To me, I'd feel bad if I didn't leave a lasting heritage here, and that's what this is going to do.
Hello, and welcome to today's Hatch Center Symposium. By way of introduction, my name is Matt Sandgren, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Orrin G. Hatch Foundation. And I'm honored today to speak with New York Times bestselling author and TV producer, Bill Doyle. Bill is the author of the forthcoming Titan of the Senate, Orrin Hatch and the Once and Future Golden Age of Bipartisanship. For the last several years, Bill has logged literally thousands of hours of research and conducted countless interviews to write one of the most ambitious biographies written about Utah's longest serving senator. Bill's biography is a story of a conservative champion who shaped modern America by passing more bills into law than any other senator in the post-Vietnam era. Bill's account of Senator Hatch's remarkable life incorporates interviews with the senator himself, as well as interviews with many of his Senate colleagues, and he's referenced over 10,000 pages of research from the U.S. Senate historian files. The Titan of the Senate will be available for purchase in major bookstores across the country starting on Tuesday, September 20th. To all of you who are viewing this webinar, the book publisher is providing a 25% discount off of the retail price for all books purchased via booksamillion.com. Please use the promo code TITAN25 to receive your discount. Welcome, Bill. Let's get started. I am so grateful that you've taken time from your busy book tour schedule to drop in on this webinar today. And you know, before we're going to talk a lot about your book and about the senator himself, but I want to spend a few moments talking about you. Let's learn a little about your own background, the work you've done both as a writer and a TV producer.
Well, thanks very much, Matt. It's great to be with you. I am from New York City. In college, I worked in the United States Senate as a lowliest of lowly interns for conservative, and that's capital C, United States Senator James Buckley in the late 70s, which was just about the time that Orrin Hatch was coming into the Senate. I went to GW in Washington, D.C., and then I went to New York City, where I had a career in advertising and a career in television that's continued to this day. I've produced TV programs for HBO, the History Channel, PBS, and A&E. And at the same time, I've written books about the history of the U.S. Navy SEALs, about President Kennedy's time in World War II. I wrote a book called Inside the Oval Office, where I got to interview Oval Office insiders dating back to Franklin Roosevelt's personal secretary, through Henry Kissinger, through the Reagan cabinet and White House staff. So I gained this, what I think is an astonishing perspective on American history. I think that American history is one of the greatest thrillers or detective stories or action stories ever. And I think that the story of Orrin Hatch surprisingly provides, in my book, I explore five, I think they're epic showdowns and accomplishments inside the walls of the United States Senate that really define Orrin Hatch's importance to history. And of course, he was the longest serving Republican senator ever. He was the, most importantly, he was defined by a nonpartisan think tank, the Center for Effective Legislating, which is a think tank out of Vanderbilt and University of Virginia. That think tank ranked Orrin Hatch as the #1 most effective senator of the post-Vietnam War American age. Now, when you stop and think about that, he becomes an astonishingly interesting character who, of course, entered the Senate. It was his first political job. He entered the Senate as a almost totally unknown local trial attorney in Salt Lake City, Utah. And he ended his career as the #3 person in line to the presidency. So I can't think of a more action-packed and consequential American story than the story of Senator Orrin Hatch.
And Bill, I look forward in our Q&A session here to talk a little more about those 5 pillars that you mentioned. But even in your introductory remarks, you mentioned that you've had a prolific career in writing, and you've rubbed shoulders with many of the notables and greats in our American public life, and you could have written about anyone, really. I'm really curious to know what inspired you to choose to write about Orrin Hatch and consequentially write the Titan of the Senate.
Well, I think many people may have an image in their minds of Orrin Hatch from the Sunday talk shows as a distinguished older gentleman talking about any number of issues on that were important to America at that time. But I think of him as having 2 very, very strong and almost contradictory on the surface personalities. One was that of the short answer to your question is he's complicated. And I like that in the people I write about. On the one hand, he was a strong conservative, bedrock conservative thinker and legislator and believer. He was pretty much Ronald Reagan's anointed senator in 1982 for his second term in office, the critical support of Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan inspired his race in 1976-77 as well. Critical character in Hatch's life. But at the same time, Orrin Hatch had this amazing impulse to reach across the aisle, as they say, befriend Ted Kennedy or Tom Harkin or Amy Klobuchar, depending on what era we're talking about, and do great things with them that were not liberal or conservative achievements. They were achievements that took America higher and forward. And every time Senator Hatch got involved in a piece of legislation, he tended to either bring it to the middle or bring it far forward from where it could have been. And my book is filled with several examples of that. And that's what I think we need today. Lawmakers who have firm convictions, but can think creatively with innovation and with helping their fellow American as the core of why they go to work every day.
It's interesting you bring up how the senator was a foot soldier in the Reagan Revolution. And, just knowing that Senator Hatch received President Reagan's endorsement, I mean, there he is back in those days. And then on the other side of that coin, he was very close and personal friends with the late Ted Kennedy, the liberal lion of the Senate. And you see how those two were able to get so much accomplished legislatively. Is that, as you went through that research and recognizing those 2 points, Reagan and Kennedy, what surprised you most in your research about the senator?
What surprised me is the ability to do both those things at the same time. And Hatch often said that I was elected to come to Washington and get things done, not just to stop things, not just to, I'm paraphrasing, score political points. And you know, Matt, there are other ways of measuring political effectiveness. One way is to stop things you don't want to happen because you think they're bad for America. A perfect example of that, one of the biggest examples, I'd argue, since the Vietnam War, was the day that Orrin Hatch decided to try to stop the biggest expansion, what he thought was unreasonable expansion, and this is the first big set piece drama in my book, of American union power. He was a union man. He spent, I think it was 6 years in a trade union himself, and his father was a union leader. But he thought that the Wagner Act in the Roosevelt years gave unions sufficient power and arbitration to thrive and properly represent the worker. And in 1977, President Carter and the AFL-CIO had a piece of legislation they thought was going to fly through Congress, and it was going to dramatically increase the power of the unions. Now, Orrin Hatch was afraid that that would automatically increase the Democratic Party's power and funding overnight by multiple factors, and that was a dangerous thing for American democracy. And he raised his hand and said, I'll try to stop this. And it was almost like a David and Goliath battle, where now he did have American business on his side, where he launched an incredible fight to stop this legislation, which he thought was terribly flawed. And he did it. So when he did that, he automatically was being looked at as a potential presidential candidate by mainstream press. And he had the credibility, Matt, inside the Republican Party and conservatism itself to then do bold things with Ted Kennedy or with fellow Republicans on the Health and Labor Committee, in the health field particularly, and to get great things done. Only a few years after that, of course, in 1984, he and Representative Waxman of California, a stalwart liberal, passed the Hatch-Waxman Act, which effectively creates the generic drug industry in this country. As of today, that saved several $1 trillion for you and I, for the American taxpayer. That's a good example of what he started to do in the 1980s and 90s, which I think is a great model for today.
You know, Bill, I want to talk a little more about your research. I mentioned in my opening comments that you referenced over 10,000 pages of files held by the U.S. Senate historian. I mean, I can't even imagine how much you have had to go through as you went through all those documents. But add on top of that, the layer of the complexities that you had to navigate through during the pandemic. Give us a little insight of how that all worked.
Well, you know, I did when I was working in the Senate, one of the things I did was I had an assignment to go into the Senate historian's office and do a project for Senator Buckley. And so I knew how good they were back then, a long time ago when I was in college, and I re-engaged them in the research for this book. Of course, I did most of this during COVID, almost all of it, but they stayed in business, and they have, lucky for me, they had just digitized vast collections of files. So in the end, I reviewed literally 10,000 plus pages of research from their files, which is organized by senator and sometimes by subject. So I would call them up and say, can you send over your file on Senator Jim Allen, a long forgotten Democratic conservative who was like a father figure to Hatch, taught him all the tricks of the Senate, the inside maneuvers. And they would send me a digitized file all about James Allen, press clippings, internal correspondence. So it was a real gold mine and a treasure trove. The other pillar of my research, of course, was to interview Senator Hatch himself in 2020 and 2021, and often on the phone. And the foundation was good enough to enable me to access their files, your files. But actually, some of my greatest moments were with fellow senators who worked with Orrin Hatch, from Sam Nunn to Susan Collins, a very long list of senators, Joe Lieberman, and Gordon Smith. Gordon Smith gave me the most interesting insight, I think. He said, you know, the secret to, I'm paraphrasing, the secret to Orrin Hatch is he saw the nobility in his opponents. the nobility in his opponents. Can you imagine that? It's an impulse that I think we've largely forgotten about in American politics, and I think that we all should always pause to remember that. And he also saw, with his deep religious faith, he saw everyone pretty much as children of God. And when you look at things that way, I think you have a whole different perspective on politics itself. And his accomplishments over the year really bear that out.
You know, that's actually one of the questions I was going to ask you is, as you went through all those interviews with all of his former colleagues, you know, you mentioned Senator Smith. What did you learn about the senator that you had not known? Obviously, he was a well-accomplished lawmaker. He was a God-fearing man, but treated everyone with respect regardless of party. And I'm not surprised what Senator Smith says about the nobility, seeing others. Are there any other nuggets that you were able to glean from your interviews that don't give too much away, as we all want to read the book? But what any other things that you want to share?
I think the Orrin Hatch's finest hour, where everyone, liberals, conservatives, I'm deadly serious, should be standing up and cheering, is a moment that you really could not see unless what I did was to go back in time and interview all the people in the Senate hallway off the floor of the Senate and the conference room adjoining the Senate hallway in mid-1990, when the Americans with Disabilities Act, the greatest civil rights act since the 1960s, a piece of legislation that reshaped not only the United States, but the world, in the sense that it inspired similar legislation all around the world. This is the moment when Orrin Hatch and Steny Hoyer stepped off the Senate floor and were greeted with shouting and tears in a room full of civil disability rights leaders, including the fellow in the hat with his on the bottom in the center on the bottom with his hand to his head, who is crying. That's Justin Dart, who was sort of the Martin Luther King of the disability rights movement, and they were thanking him and praising the work that he did, because if it wasn't for Orrin Hatch and Tom Harkin and a whole team of legislators, but especially Orrin Hatch, at a critical moment, the ADA might never have happened. And that's not according to Bill Doyle. That's according to the Pat Wright, the leader of the legislative action group behind pushing for the Americans with Disabilities Act, one of the people in the hallway. So I was able to find the people who were in the hallway, in the cloakroom, and in that room you just saw, and talk about what happened. It's like a ticking clock drama where Orrin Hatch was faced with an impossible challenge. Jesse Helms was on the floor of the Senate about to kill or delay indefinitely the ADA, and Orrin Hatch had to come up with a solution. And he thought he had the answer, and he went onto the Senate floor with handwritten notes, and he started talking to a very small audience on C-SPAN. You would have missed it if you weren't watching it. But in the end, he changed history almost single-handedly. And he did that once with ADA, and he did it again with a great, great piece of federal legislation called the Ryan White CARE Act for AIDS and HIV. The same summer of glory, I call it a summer of glory, when Ryan White, the greatest hero of that struggle, was in danger of completely going down in flames. And according to Michael Isikoff, Senator Kennedy's AIDS advisor, if it wasn't for Senator Hatch, that might never have happened either. And that act committed the federal government to try to conquer AIDS or come up with treatments, and it did. And to this day, that act and its reauthorizations, which were fought for by Orrin Hatch, today serve more than half of the HIV/AIDS patients in America, and it's the lower income and often minority group of that group of Americans. So, this is like, you're really changing American history in your bare hands with a lot of help, but you don't really see the impact of it till decades later. And that's what fascinates me about some of the things that Orrin Hatch did, with sometimes very much so with Ted Kennedy, where they were fighting liberals, conservatives, and just trying to get things done for the country.
You know, Bill, you've done a beautiful job just in this discussion together of giving us a neat overview of those milestones. And I see that you had 5 of those milestones that fit nicely with your chapters. I'm curious, from the ADA to the labor dispute, the Hatch-Waxman, give us just the high points of just tick off those 5 milestones. And how did you decide to do that? It's a 42-year, I can imagine how daunting that is. I'm a longtime former Hatch staffer. I have my ideas. I know that the Hatch network, they all have their own ideas. How did you zero in on those 5 milestones and repeat those 5 milestones for our viewers?
Sure. The first was the labor reform battle of 1977-78, when Hatch pretty much single-handedly stopped a dramatic expansion of union power that he thought was unreasonable in America. And really, since then, the American labor movement has lived within the constraints and the powers that it had in 1977 and 1978. There's been no major change since then. The second big event was that I explore in detail, although I explore a lot of his career, was the two events that I call the Summer of Glory. Summer of 1990, Americans with Disabilities Act, when Hatch, and I am not exaggerating here, single-handedly stepped forward at the 11th hour and 59 minutes and battled to save the Americans with Disabilities Act, and did it. Similar actions took place with the same year with the Ryan White CARES Act for HIV/AIDS, which I would argue any objective observer would conclude that his success there, that legislation saved countless American lives, LGBTQ plus and others, by committing the federal government to the research and treatment and education and developing medicines and launching super hospitals, medical centers around the country to deal with this health problem affecting so many Americans. There were two more issues that were rather astonishing. One is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, Matt, which, as you know, started as Chuck Schumer's legislation in the House. And Orrin Hatch thought it was a very good idea. He had some changes to make. There was a Senate version that he got on board, again, with Ted Kennedy and with other Republicans, to reinvigorate the constitutional protections of freedom of religion in our country. There were Supreme Court battles, unexpected twists and turns, but that legislation inspired a raft of state legislation and eventually Supreme Court decisions that upheld Hatch's impulse to defend and strengthen those constitutional protections. And that started off as a purely, remarkably bipartisan effort. And then finally, there was one of the most creative things that Hatch ever did, and that's in my opinion, the state children's health insurance program. Now, at the time in the 1990s, Hatch and Kennedy served on the health committee, and they would trade the chairmanship. And Senator Hatch was in a strange position because liberal Republicans and Democrats outnumbered Republicans and conservatives, or conservative Republicans. And in order to get anything done, he could try to filibuster everything, but he didn't want to. He knew that America needed help with stem cell research, organ transplant legislation, strengthening the CDC, a whole range of health issues. But he and Kennedy saw that there were millions of American children of families that were poor. They weren't so poor that they qualified for pure welfare assistance when it came to medical aid, but they could not afford insurance to buy on the market. So they said, let's develop something to fill that gap for these millions of American children. And Ted Kennedy wanted to make this a federal entitlement, a big new bureaucracy, like very simple to do that. And that's often the impulse of the federal government or Congress. And Orrin Hatch said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to make this a block grant to the states. How are we going to pay for this? Let's see. Cigarette tax. Now, a cigarette tax is not as unpopular in Utah as it might be in other states for obvious reasons. And that intellectual combat between Kennedy and Hatch resulted in shouting matches, often between the two of them behind closed doors, beefy, red-faced arguments by Kennedy. And he would shout that Hatch had betrayed him. You've betrayed me. You've ruined this whole, and then he would calm down, and he realized that now what Hatch had done was he kind of blowtorched the legislation to enable Republicans and conservatives to support it. Now, it wasn't that easy, and there was Republican opposition to it. But guess what? Today, the state children's health insurance program has been going on for at least a quarter century, and it is held up as a model of creative, innovative federal legislation. And today, it helps millions of American children. So again, these are accomplishments that are monumental in retrospect and in the moment of drama when they get created, but they get kind of lost in the shuffle of Supreme Court battles or Sunday Meet the Press appearances when we're not really looking at the deep picture, which is what I've tried to do.
Bill, here at the Hatch Foundation, we believe that Senator Hatch's legacy is needed more than ever before during our nation's history. Tell us why the Orrin Hatch story that you've written about is so relevant for 2022 and looking ahead for all the rising generation, for the current brand of politicians on both sides of the aisle, as we are now in a heated midterm election and soon to be in a presidential election. I'm curious to know how this all fits into modern day. Far too often, we don't want to be stuck in the past. We want to talk about how this applies to us today. Give us some thoughts on that.
Right. I want to stress that I see Hatch as intensely human and capable of mistakes, as I outline in the book, and certainly debatable depending on his achievements. Some of his biggest achievements are debatable depending on what side of the ideological spectrum you fall on. But I am convinced, absolutely convinced, that Orrin Hatch should serve as an inspiration and a model for everybody in Congress now and everybody who gets elected in the midterms and everybody who wants to serve this country in the immediate future. And what I mean by that is, number one, civility. As John Kennedy said, civility is not a sign of weakness. It's not. Number two, creative and innovative solutions to American problems, which is what we desperately need on energy, childcare, education, immigration, even infrastructure. And of course, there have been some great bipartisan achievements, strikingly, in the last few months on gun safety, on infrastructure, NATO expansion, strengthen aid to Ukraine. It's a really amazing list. At the same time, we have, hysteria or real concerns over Hunter Biden's laptop or Donald Trump's files. I think that Orrin Hatch serves as a model for any legislator, and especially the way he reached out to the other side and changed their mind and shaped their thinking and negotiated with them and got things done with them. That's why we elect lawmakers, not just to tear each other down and to get on cable news and to perform, have angry performances. But I think the American people, Matt, and media must start rewarding politicians on their ability to get things done like Orrin Hatch did. So it's amazing. I think it's really notable that you had this partnership with the Kennedy Institute, because nothing better represents, I think, the beauty of American democracy when people are arguing and clashing and trying to convince each other that they're right, but in the end, they feel obliged to get something done positive and constructive. So I can't think of a better model to inspire lawmakers and Congress today.
Bill, that is beautifully said. We look forward to reading your book. Thank you again for joining us today. Best of luck with the rest of your book tour. We know that you've got some very, very busy days and weeks ahead for you. And to, again, those who are interested in purchasing Titan, be sure to use promo code Titan25. You will receive a 25% discount off of the retail price for all books purchased at booksamillion.com. That promotion is going to run from September 21st to September 25th. To everyone who's dialed in and joined, we thank you for joining us. And we wish you all the best. And again, Bill, it's always good to see you. I look forward to reading the book.
Thank you, Matt.
Be well.